For centuries, there's been this huge, sprawling conversation unfolding around the work of the 13th century commentator Ramban. Scholars have spent entire careers trying to trace all the different threads, relying on their own memory and just incredibly detailed reading. But what if you could actually see that conversation? What if you could map it? Well, a new project is doing exactly that, and we're about to see how it works.
And that's really the core question, isn't it? Instead of just reading these texts one after another, this new approach transforms them into these amazing intellectual maps. It lets us visualize how ideas flow across hundreds of years in a way that's, well, it's never been possible before.
So, it all starts with Ramban's commentary on the Torah. It's this monumental work from the 13th century, and it mixes everything: law, philosophy, even mysticism. And for the next 700 years, other scholars just kept building on his work. They created this enormous network of responses, arguments, and new ideas. It's this incredibly rich, complicated dialogue that stretches across centuries.
And this slide really gets to the heart of the matter. On one hand, you've got the traditional way of doing things, close reading. It's absolutely irreplaceable for its depth, but it's also limited by human memory and just the sheer volume of these texts. But on the other hand, we now have this new computational approach. It gives you a kind of bird's-eye view, revealing these huge patterns and hidden connections that a single person, no matter how brilliant, might never be able to see.
So how is this even possible? Well, the big shift here is that we're moving away from seeing texts as just a long string of words. Instead, we're starting to understand them as these complex networks of ideas. We're literally creating a whole new kind of map for intellectual history. The main tool here is something called a knowledge graph. Honestly, the best way to think about it is just as a concept map, like one you might have drawn in school, but this one is generated by a machine. So, for example, when the system reads a sentence like, "Ramban says the cherubim represent the divine chariot," it doesn't just see the words. It actually identifies Ramban and cherubim as concepts and represents as the specific link between them.
And this is why it's so incredibly powerful. Just searching for keywords is, well, it's pretty clumsy. A simple search would totally miss that throne of glory and divine seat are really talking about the same idea. But a knowledge graph, it gets the meaning. It's not asking, hey, did you use the exact same words? It's asking, did you build the same argument, the same conceptual structure? And that lets it find connections that are way deeper than just the surface.
Okay, so how do you actually get from a dusty medieval manuscript to a dynamic digital network? It turns out the process is this really cool blend of deep scholarship and cutting-edge technology.
Now, it's really important to get what the AI is doing here. It's not a writer. It's not trying to summarize anything. Think of it more like a super specialized research assistant. First, human experts teach it what to look for in this very specific type of literature. Then, it just meticulously reads the text with one single goal: to pull out every concept it can find and map out every relationship between them.
And here is the payoff. This is where it gets really amazing. Once we have a conceptual map for Ramban's work and another one for a later commentator, we can just overlay them. And suddenly, that hidden, centuries-long conversation becomes visible.
So to understand what we're about to see, you just need this simple color code. It's easy. Green means shared ideas. That's the common ground between the two thinkers. Red means ideas that are unique to the later commentator. This is their new contribution. And blue? That's stuff from Ramban that the commentator just decided not to talk about. Green, red, blue. That's it.
And boom, here are the results. Just look at this. On the left, you see a map that's just dominated by green. This shows a commentator who is deeply, deeply engaged with Ramban's ideas. You could call them a convergent thinker. But on the right, it's a sea of red. This is a totally different beast, a divergent thinker, who's basically using Ramban as a launchpad for their own very different arguments. The visual difference is it's stunning.
And the numbers, well, they tell the exact same story our eyes just did. Take a look at Ibn Shu'ab. He shares 14 core concepts with Ramban. But then you look at the Da'at Chakam manuscript, and it's only 4. But the real kicker, the most telling number, is in that last column, shared arguments. Ibn Shu'ab is actually building on Ramban's structure. Da'at Chakam, 0. Not a single shared argument.
Let's just zoom in for a second on that convergent map, the one for Ibn Shu'ab. You can clearly see that dense green core of shared ideas, the ark, the cherubim, the throne of glory. This is the absolute heart of Ramban's argument. And Ibn Shu'ab's own ideas, all those red dots, they're like satellites orbiting that core. He's not breaking away, he's building out from the foundation that was already there.
But what about the opposite situation?
What happens when a commentator uses all the same basic words as Ramban, but is actually building a completely different argument from the ground up?
This, for me, is maybe the most mind-blowing discovery. There's this manuscript called Deat Shacham, and it uses all the right keywords. Cherubim, throne of glory, but the analysis reveals that it shares exactly 0 structural arguments with Ramban. 0. It is the perfect example of how two thinkers can use the exact same vocabulary to build entirely different intellectual worlds.
And this map for another commentary called Mirat Ainaim shows that divergence perfectly. See that tiny little green cluster of shared words over there? Now look at that massive, completely separate cluster of red. That's all unique ideas. This is the visual proof of a much more independent thinker, someone who just barely touches on Ramban's framework before blasting off in a totally new direction.
Okay, so let's step back for a second. What does this new atlas of ideas actually show us? Now that we can see this medieval conversation all mapped out, what have we really learned?
Well, for starters, it uncovers the hidden skeleton of arguments, something that just matching words could never do. It also shows us that the so-called Ramban school wasn't some single unified thing. It was a really diverse family of thinkers with wildly different approaches. And now we can actually quantify each person's unique contribution. We can even use these intellectual fingerprints to help figure out who might have written anonymous works.
And this right here is probably the most important takeaway of all. This technology isn't here to replace the humanities scholar, not at all. Its purpose is to give them a new superpower. It provides a powerful new kind of map, a new tool that lets us look at a very old landscape with completely fresh eyes and start asking questions we never even knew we had.
And that leads to this final thrilling question. We've just seen the map of one relatively small conversation. As this technology gets better and gets applied more widely, what other hidden networks, what forgotten influences, what entire intellectual continents are just out there, waiting to be discovered in the vast library of human history?